February 1944. The sky over central Germany turns white with condensation trails. More than 800 heavy bombers climb through freezing air, their engines screaming at 25,000 feet. Inside those vibrating aluminum tubes, young American men breathe pure oxygen through rubber masks, their breath crystallizing instantly in temperatures that plunge to -50 degrees. The waist gunners stamp their feet against the frost forming on the floor plates. Hands shake inside leather gloves as they grip 50 caliber machine guns. Every man knows the mathematics of death that hang over them. In the past 6 months, the 8th Air Force has been bleeding out over Europe. And every single airman understands that today could be his last flight. But something is different this morning. A formation of sleek, long-nosed fighters pulls alongside the bomber stream, their polished aluminum fuselages catching the morning sun. The radio crackles with a voice every bomber crew has learned to love. "Little friends are with you, boys. We'll take you all the way." Those fighters are the North American P-51 Mustang, and the Luftwaffe has absolutely no idea what is about to hit them. If you enjoy immersive military history and want to understand how technology, tactics, and human courage shape the world we live in, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. You will not want to miss what comes next. To understand why this single aircraft changed everything, we need to step back and witness the disaster that preceded it. The year is 1943. The United States Army Air Forces is bleeding to death over Europe. American military doctrine is built on one unshakable belief that heavily armed bomber formations can fight their way to any target in daylight and return home without fighter escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress carries 13 50 caliber machine guns. The B-24 Liberator bristles with 10. Military planners believe that when these aircraft fly in tight combat boxes, their overlapping fields of fire will create an impenetrable wall of lead that no enemy fighter can survive. They are catastrophically wrong. The Luftwaffe adapts. German tacticians study the American formations and find their weaknesses. They discover that attacking from directly ahead from 12 o'clock high forces bomber gunners to track targets moving at closure speeds of over 600 miles per hour. The human reaction time simply cannot keep up. German pilots developed the Sturmbach tactic, where heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s dive through the bomber stream from above, their 30mm cannons tearing bombers apart with single hits. A burst of fire that lasts 2 seconds can send a B-17 spiraling down in flames. In August of 1943, the 8th Air Force launches a coordinated strike against 2 critical German industrial complexes. 230 B-17s attack the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, while a separate force hits the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets lie deep inside Germany, far beyond the range of any Allied escort fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt can only accompany the bombers for approximately 200 miles before fuel constraints force them to turn back. Beyond that point, the bombers are alone. The results are devastating. 60 bombers go down on that single mission. 600 young Americans are eliminated, captured, or vanish without a trace. The loss rate exceeds 26%. At that rate of attrition, a bomber crew has almost no statistical chance of completing the required 25 missions to go home. The men do the math in their heads. They look at the empty bunks in their barracks. They see friends disappear over the horizon, never to return. The carnage reaches its crescendo in October 1943 during a week that becomes known simply as Black Week. On October 8th, bombers attack Bremen and Wegessack. On October 9th, they strike East Prussia. On October 10th, Münster. And on October 14th, they return to Schweinfurt for a second attempt. That day, later called Black Thursday, becomes seared into the memory of every surviving airman. Of the 229 bombers that reach the target, 60 are shot down. Dozens more limp home with engines on fire, hydraulics destroyed, and dead and wounded crewmen slumped over their guns. During Black Week alone, the 8th Air Force loses 148 heavy bombers. That represents approximately 1,500 air crew members eliminated, wounded, or captured in just 7 days. The bunks in the barracks stand empty. The poker games grow quieter. Young men who laughed together the week before are now listed as missing in action. The losses are so severe that deep bombing raids into Germany are temporarily suspended. The entire strategic air offensive teeters on the edge of collapse. This is the crisis that demands a solution, and that solution already exists, waiting in the wings, born from the genius of a German immigrant and the scientific principles of aerodynamics that the Luftwaffe itself helped to develop. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins in an unlikely place, the drafting tables of a man named Edgar Schmude. Born in Hornbach, Germany in 1899, Schmude possesses dual Austrian and German citizenship through his father. He studies engineering in Europe before immigrating to the United States in 1930, eventually finding work at a small aircraft manufacturer called North American Aviation in California. By 1940, Schmude has risen to become chief of preliminary design. He is methodical, brilliant, and possessed by an obsession with aerodynamic efficiency. In April of that year, a British purchasing commission arrives in the United States with an urgent request. The Royal Air Force desperately needs more fighter aircraft. They ask North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawks under license, providing additional production capacity for an aircraft already in service. The request seems straightforward. Schmude refuses. He looks at the P-40 and sees an aircraft that is already obsolete. Its design dates from the late 1930s. Its aerodynamics are adequate but uninspired. Schmude knows he can do better. He tells the British that instead of building someone else's outdated design, North American will create an entirely new fighter from scratch, and they will do it in just 120 days. The British are skeptical but desperate. They agree to the proposal. On April 10, 1940, North American Aviation signs a contract to design and build a prototype fighter designated the NA-73X. The clock starts ticking. What follows is one of the most remarkable feats of aircraft engineering in aviation history. Schmude locks himself in his office with his design team. He works through nights and weekends. He draws on every principle of modern aerodynamics, determined to create not just an adequate fighter, but the most aerodynamically efficient aircraft ever designed for combat. His team studies the latest research from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the American government agency tasked with advancing the science of flight. And there, in those technical papers, Schmude finds the key that will unlock everything. The concept is called laminar flow. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how air moves over a wing. When an aircraft flies, air splits around the leading edge and flows backward toward the trailing edge. At the boundary where moving air meets the wing surface, two different types of airflow can exist. Near the front of the wing, airflow tends to be smooth and parallel, with air particles moving in orderly layers that slide past each other with minimal friction. This is laminar flow. But as air continues backward over the wing surface, small disturbances accumulate. The orderly layers break down into chaotic swirls and eddies. This is turbulent flow, and it creates far more friction against the wing surface, which translates directly into drag. On a conventional 1930s wing design, laminar flow only exists across the first 5% of the wing surface. After that, the airflow transitions to turbulence, and drag increases dramatically. The secret Schmude discovers is that by carefully reshaping the wing profile, you can extend the region of laminar flow much further back. A conventional wing places its maximum thickness at about 30% of the distance from the leading edge to the trailing edge, but a laminar flow wing moves that maximum thickness further back to about 45% of the chord. This more gradual increase in wing thickness encourages the airflow to remain smooth for much longer. The theoretical benefits are extraordinary. A true laminar flow wing could reduce drag by 25 to 50% compared to conventional designs. Even in practical conditions, where manufacturing imperfections and real-world combat damage prevent perfect laminar flow, the drag reduction remains significant. Every engineer understands what lower drag means: higher speed with the same engine power, longer range with the same fuel load, better climb rate, improved performance across every measurable metric. But Schmood and his team at North American are not dreamers. They understand perfectly well that the manufacturing technology of the early 1940s cannot produce the mirror-smooth wing surfaces required for perfect laminar flow. Paint imperfections, rivet heads, even insect remains on the leading edge will trip the laminar flow into turbulence. The company internally calls their new wing the high-speed, low-drag design, never making extravagant claims about achieving full laminar flow. In reality, the wing achieves perhaps 10 to 15% laminar flow in operational conditions. But here is what matters. Even that partial benefit, combined with Schmood's obsessive attention to reducing drag everywhere else on the aircraft, produces a fighter of unprecedented efficiency. The fuselage is designed with careful attention to cross-sectional area, eliminating unnecessary bumps and protrusions. The belly radiator scoop is engineered not just to cool the engine, but to produce thrust from the hot air exiting at the rear, partially recovering the energy lost to cooling. Every design decision focuses on one goal: extracting maximum performance from minimum power. The result is extraordinary. On October 26, 1940, just 102 days after signing the contract, the NA-73X prototype rolls out of the North American factory in Inglewood, California. It is sleek, elegant, and unmistakably modern. The first flight takes place on October 26th with test pilot Vance Breeze at the controls. Even with the relatively modest Allison V1710 engine, the aircraft demonstrates exceptional speed and handling characteristics. The British are impressed. They order the aircraft into production as the Mustang Mark I, initially using it for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack missions. The Royal Air Force discovers that the Mustang is fast, agile, and carries twice the fuel of a Spitfire, giving it significantly greater range. But there is a problem, a critical flaw that prevents the Mustang from reaching its true potential: the Allison engine. At low altitudes, the Allison V1710 performs adequately. It produces approximately 1,100 horsepower and propels the Mustang to speeds that match contemporary fighters. But the Allison engine uses a single-stage supercharger that loses efficiency as altitude increases. Above 15,000 feet, engine power drops rapidly. Above 20,000 feet, the Mustang cannot compete with German fighters that are specifically optimized for high-altitude interception. And the air war over Europe takes place at 25,000 feet, where the heavy bombers fly to stay above the reach of light anti-aircraft guns. For nearly 2 years, the Mustang remains a promising but limited aircraft, useful for ground attack and reconnaissance, but incapable of fulfilling the role that the 8th Air Force desperately needs: a long-range, high-altitude escort fighter that can accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The solution sits in Britain, powering Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. But bringing together the American airframe and the British engine requires vision, persistence, and more than a little luck. The hero of this part of the story is a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker. In April 1942, Harker flies a Mustang Mark I for the first time. He is immediately struck by the aircraft's exceptional handling and aerodynamic efficiency, but he also recognizes the fundamental limitation of the Allison engine. Harker is an experienced pilot who understands engines intimately, And he knows exactly which engine could transform the Mustang into something extraordinary: the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Specifically, Harker envisions mating the Mustang airframe with the Merlin's 61 engine. This version of the Merlin features a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintains full power at high altitudes. It is the same engine that has transformed the Spitfire Mark IX into a world-beating fighter capable of matching the latest German designs. Harker returns from his test flight and immediately begins advocating for a Merlin-powered Mustang within Rolls-Royce. His superiors are skeptical. The Air Ministry in London shows little interest. Rolls-Royce production is already allocated entirely to Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. There are no engines to spare for an experimental conversion of an American aircraft. But Harker is persistent, eventually gaining the support of Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who authorizes a small-scale conversion program. In August 1942, the Royal Air Force begins installing Merlin 65 engines into 5 Mustang airframes. These aircraft are designated the Mustang Mark X. The first conversion flies on October 13, 1942, with Rolls-Royce Chief Test Pilot Captain R.T. Shepard at the controls. The results exceed everyone's expectations. With the Merlin engine, the Mustang transforms. Top speed jumps by approximately 80 kilometers per hour, reaching 710 kilometers per hour at altitude. The service ceiling climbs to 42,000 feet. High-altitude performance now matches or exceeds any fighter in the world. The same aerodynamically efficient airframe that Schmood designed now has an engine capable of exploiting its full potential. The fusion of American airframe and British engine creates something unprecedented, a fighter that combines extraordinary speed, exceptional range, and excellent high-altitude performance in a single package. But the Merlin Mustang faces a critical obstacle. Every Merlin engine coming off British production lines is already committed to existing aircraft programs. The Royal Air Force simply cannot spare engines for large-scale Mustang production. The solution comes from across the Atlantic. The Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit holds a license to manufacture Merlin engines in the United States. American production capacity can supply what British factories cannot. North American Aviation, now fully aware of the British conversion results, begins designing their own Merlin-powered variant. The first American-built Merlin Mustang, powered by a Packard Phi 1653 engine, flies on November 30, 1942. The United States Army Air Forces designates the new variant the P-51B. Production accelerates through 1943, with aircraft flowing off the assembly lines at an increasing rate. By the winter of 1943 to 44, the pieces are falling into place. The P-51B and its improved successor, the P-51D, begin arriving in England in significant numbers. With external drop tanks, these aircraft can fly more than 1,800 miles on a combat mission. For the first time since the strategic bombing campaign began, escort fighters can accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, providing protection throughout the entire mission instead of abandoning the bombers over hostile territory. This is exactly the moment we return to our opening scene, February 1944. The cold skies over Germany, and 1,000 young men about to change the course of history. If you are finding this story compelling, remember that subscribing and engaging with the video helps the channel continue producing content like this. Now, let us return to the frozen skies over the Reich. The men who command the 8th Air Force understand that simply having a long-range escort fighter is not enough. They need to use it correctly. And in January 1944, a new commander arrives who will revolutionize how American fighters fight over Europe. His name is James Harold Doolittle. Everyone calls him Jimmy. Doolittle is already a legend. In April 1942, he led the first American bombing raid against Japan, launching B-25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier in what seemed like an impossible mission. He received the Medal of Honor. He is 57 years old, holds a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and possesses a combination of academic brilliance and combat experience that is almost unique in the American military. When he takes command of the 8th Air Force, he brings fresh thinking to a crisis that has ground down his predecessors. The existing doctrine dictates that escort fighters must stay close to the bombers they protect, weaving back and forth above the formation like sheepdogs guarding a flock. The logic seems sound. If the fighters wander too far away, German interceptors might slip through and attack the bombers. But Doolittle sees the fundamental problem with this approach. As long as American fighters remain tied to the bombers, they surrender the initiative to the Germans. The Luftwaffe can choose when and where to attack, massing strength at weak points while the escorting fighters react passively to each threat. Doolittle makes a decision that horrifies some of his bomber commanders. He changes the fundamental mission of his fighters. A new sign goes up at 8th Air Force headquarters. It reads, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters, not to protect the bombers, to destroy the enemy." This is a revolutionary change in philosophy. Doolittle understands that the only way to truly protect the bombers is to eliminate the threat before it can attack. He orders his fighters to leave the bomber formations when opportunities arise, to pursue German fighters aggressively, to sweep ahead of the bombers and clear the sky before the enemy can organize. Most importantly, he authorizes his fighters to attack Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground, strafing airfields and catching German planes as they take off or land. The results are immediate and devastating. German fighter pilots who have grown accustomed to hit-and-run attacks on lumbering bombers suddenly find themselves hunted by aggressive American fighters that refuse to let them escape. The P-51's superior speed means that German aircraft cannot simply dive away to safety. The Mustang can follow them down and catch them. The Bf-109 and FW-190, which once ruled the high altitudes over the Reich, now face an opponent that can match them at any height and outrun them in a chase. The Focke-Wulf 190 is an exceptional aircraft. Its air-cooled radial engine is more resistant to battle damage than the liquid-cooled engines of other fighters. Its wide undercarriage makes it stable during takeoffs and landings, reducing accidents that plague the narrow-geared Bf-109. Its heavy armament includes multiple cannons designed specifically for destroying bombers, but the 190A model is optimized for attacking heavy bombers, not for dogfighting with agile escorts. At high altitude, its performance falls behind the Mustang. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 remains a dangerous opponent in the hands of an experienced pilot. It climbs faster than the Mustang and can turn inside it in certain conditions. But the 109 is an old design, first flown in 1937, and the weight of successive modifications has burdened it with compromises. Its cramped cockpit limits pilot visibility, its narrow landing gear causes frequent ground accidents, and, crucially, its fuel capacity limits its time in combat, forcing German pilots to break off engagements while American fighters with drop tanks can continue fighting. The week of February 20th to 25th, 1944, becomes known as Big Week, or by its official name, Operation Argument. American commanders have identified that clear weather is approaching over central Germany. They plan to exploit this window with an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry, forcing the Luftwaffe to either fight and take massive losses or stand aside and watch their factories burn. On the first day, more than 1,000 heavy bombers and hundreds of escort fighters launch from bases across England. The formations stretch for miles across the sky. The targets are aircraft factories in Leipzig, Gotha, and the surrounding region. American commanders predict they might lose 200 bombers in a single day. The RAF has lost 79 heavy bombers on a night raid against Leipzig just hours earlier. Everyone expects a bloodbath. But something unexpected happens. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts tear into the German interceptors before they can reach the bomber stream. Dogfights erupt across the sky as American fighters aggressively pursue their opponents. German pilots, expecting to face unescorted bombers, suddenly find themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy that has learned to fight offensively. When the day ends, the Americans count their losses: 21 bombers and 4 fighters. The Germans have lost 153 fighters. The disparity is staggering. For the first time in the air war, the Luftwaffe has suffered losses out of all proportion to the damage it inflicted. The attacks continue for 6 days straight. On February 21st, over 900 bombers and 700 fighters strike aircraft factories in the Braunschweig area. Over 60 Luftwaffe fighters are shot down against losses of 19 bombers and 5 fighters. On February 24th, more than 800 bombers hit Schweinfurt again, the same target that caused such catastrophic losses the previous October. This time, only 11 bombers are lost. By the end of Big Week, the 8th Air Force has flown nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties and dropped more than 18,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft plants. The Luftwaffe has lost 262 fighters in combat, plus additional aircraft damaged or destroyed. Most critically, 250 German aircrew have been eliminated or wounded, including over 100 experienced fighter pilots. These numbers tell only part of the story. The 8th Air Force has dropped more bombs in 1 week than in its entire first year operating from England. American losses total 227 bombers and 42 fighters, with more than 2,000 airmen eliminated or captured. But unlike the Germans, the Americans can replace their losses. Thousands of new aircraft roll off American production lines every month. Training bases across the United States produce a steady stream of replacement pilots, each with 300 or more flight hours before they ever see combat. The Luftwaffe cannot match this industrial might. German aircraft factories, dispersed and protected though they are, cannot keep pace with losses. And far more critically, the fighter pilot training system is breaking down under the strain of combat attrition. This is where the true catastrophe for Germany begins. Aircraft can be replaced by factories. Experienced pilots cannot be replaced by any means short of time that Germany no longer has. Consider the mathematics of pilot training. An American fighter pilot arriving in England in 1944 typically has accumulated more than 300 hours of flight time. He has trained on multiple aircraft types, practiced combat maneuvers, and learned instrument flying. He arrives in the combat zone ready to fight and survive. A German replacement pilot in the same period receives perhaps 60 to 80 hours of training before being thrown into combat. Fuel shortages make extensive flight training impossible. Experienced instructors have been pulled from training bases and sent to the front to replace fallen veterans. The new pilots arrive in operational squadrons barely able to handle their aircraft, let alone fight against aggressive American opponents who have been taught to exploit every advantage. The result is a death spiral that accelerates throughout 1944. In January, the Luftwaffe loses approximately 1.8% of its fighter pilots. That number sounds manageable. But by May, monthly pilot losses have climbed to 25%. In that single month, 1/4 of all German fighter pilots are eliminated or incapacitated. Between January and May of 1944, the Luftwaffe loses 2,262 fighter pilots out of an average strength of 2,283. They have lost essentially their entire fighter pilot force in 5 months, replacing fallen veterans with ever less experienced replacements who survive for shorter and shorter periods. The attrition continues through the summer and fall. In April alone, the Luftwaffe writes off 43% of its fighters and loses 20% of its pilots on the Western Front. In May, the numbers are even worse: 50.4% of aircraft written off, 25% of pilots lost. The force is being ground to dust. An American bomber crewman can calculate that after completing a certain number of missions, he goes home. The number is 25, later raised to 30, then 35. It is a brutal lottery, but there is an end in sight. For a German fighter pilot, there is no such hope. He is already home. He flies until he is eliminated, wounded too badly to continue, or the war ends. Given the loss rates of 1944, the mathematical expectation is clear. Most German fighter pilots will not survive the year, and there is nowhere to hide. Doolittle's aggressive tactics extend the danger beyond just aerial combat. American fighters now strafe Luftwaffe airfields whenever they have fuel and ammunition remaining after escort missions. German pilots who survive combat face death while trying to land or take off, caught by prowling Mustangs. While their aircraft are most vulnerable, fuel trucks explode, maintenance personnel scramble for cover. Even on the ground, the Luftwaffe can find no safety. By June of 1944, as Allied forces prepare for the invasion of Normandy, the Luftwaffe in the West is a broken force. The hundreds of experienced fighter pilots who had made the bomber offensive so costly are gone. Their replacements lack the skill to contest Allied air superiority. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe is virtually invisible over the beaches. The greatest amphibious invasion in history takes place under skies dominated entirely by Allied aircraft. The transformation is remarkable. In 1943, 8th Air Force bomber crews faced an average loss rate of 5.1% per mission. In 1944, that rate has dropped to 1.9%. The change is directly attributable to the arrival of the P-51 and the aggressive tactics of General Doolittle. The bomber offensive is no longer bleeding to death. The bombers are getting through, and Germany is beginning to burn. But we should not let statistics obscure the human reality on both sides. Every number represents young men who climbed into cockpits, knowing they might not return. Let us consider what that experience was actually like. For an American fighter pilot flying escort over Germany, a typical mission begins before dawn. He wakes in his quarters on an English airfield, eats whatever breakfast is available in the mess hall, and attends a briefing where intelligence officers describe the day's target and expected opposition. He walks to his aircraft in the cold morning air, checks over the machine with his ground crew, and climbs into the cockpit. The Mustang cockpit is relatively spacious for a fighter. The seat is reasonably comfortable, at least by military standards. The visibility is excellent, with a bubble canopy in later models that provides nearly unrestricted views in all directions. The instruments are well laid out and logical. But as the engine starts and the fighter taxis to the runway, all comfort fades. The pilot knows that he will spend the next 6 to 8 hours strapped into this seat, flying at altitudes where the temperature drops far below zero and where every second of inattention can mean death. Take off. Form up with the squadron. Climb to altitude. The England below shrinks to a patchwork of green and brown. The Channel passes beneath, gray and cold. Then France, scarred by war, and finally Germany itself. The bombers appear ahead, their condensation trails stretching across the sky like white highways. The radio crackles with position reports and warnings, and then the fighting starts. A German attack typically comes fast. Fighters appear as distant specks, closing rapidly. The Mustang pilot pushes his throttle forward, adjusts his gun sight, and turns to engage. Everything he has learned in training compresses into seconds of life-or-death decision-making, energy management, deflection shooting, situational awareness. The sky fills with twisting, diving aircraft, tracer rounds arcing between them. For the German pilot, the experience is equally intense, but shadowed by a creeping despair that grows as 1944 progresses. He climbs out of his airfield knowing that the enemy has more fighters, better trained pilots, and seemingly unlimited fuel and ammunition. He faces not just the escort fighters, but the strafing attacks that follow, catching his comrades as they return from combat. If he survives today, tomorrow will be no different, and the day after that, and the day after that. The P-51 Mustang is not just an aircraft, it is a system of advantages that compound upon each other. Its laminar flow wing provides lower drag, which provides greater speed and range. Its Merlin engine provides power at high altitude, where bombers operate and where German fighters must intercept. Its drop tanks extend range to cover the entire round trip to Berlin, and behind it stands the industrial might of the United States, producing aircraft and training pilots faster than the Germans can destroy them. If you have come this far in the story, you understand why this aircraft matters. Please consider liking this video and sharing it with others who appreciate military history. The German response to the P-51 threat takes several forms, none of them sufficient. Engineers develop improved variants of existing fighters. The Focke-Wulf 190D, known as the Dora, replaces the radial engine with the liquid-cooled Junkers motor that improves high-altitude performance. It is a formidable aircraft, nearly a match for the Mustang in a one-on-one fight. But there are not enough of them and not enough trained pilots to fly them. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter represents a technological leap forward. It is faster than any propeller-driven aircraft, capable of speeds that allow it to slash through bomber formations with near impunity. But it arrives too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome of the war. Production is hampered by Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants. The jets consume kerosene at prodigious rates, and German fuel supplies are dwindling. Pilots capable of mastering the tricky jet engines are increasingly rare. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces continue to pound German industry without respite. The oil campaign of 1944 systematically destroys Germany's capacity to produce aviation fuel. Every month, the fuel shortage grows worse. Training flights are curtailed. Operational units receive reduced allocations. Eventually, some German fighters sit idle on their airfields because there is simply no fuel to fly them. The final act plays out in the spring of 1945. By April, the Luftwaffe exists more in name than in reality. American fighters roam freely over what remains of Germany, attacking anything that moves. On April 7th, the 8th Air Force dispatches more than 30 bomber groups and 14 Mustang groups against remaining German targets. Nearly 300 German aircraft are destroyed in strafing attacks that day alone. On April 16th, this record falls when over 700 German aircraft are destroyed on the ground. The Luftwaffe, that once terrorized Europe, that shattered Poland and France, that ravaged Britain during the Blitz, that seemed invincible for the first years of the war, has ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its pilots are dead or captured. Its aircraft are burning wreckage. Its airfields are craters. The sky belongs to the Allies. And in that sky, more than any other aircraft, the P-51 Mustang reigns supreme. The legacy of the Mustang extends far beyond the statistics of victories and losses. The aircraft demonstrates what becomes possible when advanced technology meets sound tactical doctrine. Schmood's obsession with aerodynamic efficiency, Harker's vision of the Merlin conversion, Doolittle's aggressive fighter tactics, all of these elements combine to create something greater than any single component. The whole became greater than the sum of its parts. The aircraft itself continues flying for decades after the war. The original laminar flow-wing design proves so efficient that Mustangs win air races and set speed records for piston-engine aircraft well into the 1980s. Some continue to fly today, carefully restored and maintained by enthusiasts who understand what these machines represent. But the true legacy is not the aircraft itself. It is what the aircraft allowed to happen. The strategic bombing campaign, made possible by the Mustang's escort capabilities, destroyed Germany's capacity to wage war. Factories that produced tanks, aircraft, and weapons were systematically reduced to rubble. Transportation networks that moved troops and supplies were shattered. Synthetic fuel plants that powered the war machine were eliminated. By the time Allied ground forces crossed the Rhine in the spring of 1945, Germany's industrial base had been gutted from above. The invasion of Normandy succeeded in part because the Luftwaffe could not contest it. Thousands of Allied aircraft filled the skies over the beaches, providing close air support, interdicting German reinforcements, and ensuring that the invasion force could consolidate its beachhead without interference from the air. The Mustangs and their pilots had done their work well. The enemy air force that should have defended France was already destroyed. Consider the cost. More than 40,000 Luftwaffe aircrew were eliminated in action during the war. Approximately 28,000 more were wounded. Another 27,000 were reported missing, most of them never found. The German pilot corps of 1939, those veterans who had conquered Poland and France, had been almost entirely wiped out by 1944. Their replacements died faster than they could be trained. The American losses were significant but sustainable. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 4,000 heavy bombers and 2,000 fighters during the strategic bombing campaign. More than 26,000 aircrew were eliminated, and nearly 28,000 became prisoners of war. But American industrial capacity replaced every lost aircraft. American training programs produced replacement crews faster than the enemy could eliminate them. The mathematics of attrition favored the Allies at every level. This is what the P-51 Mustang truly represents. Not just a beautiful aircraft, though it is certainly that. Not just a technological achievement, though its design incorporates innovations that influenced aviation for decades. The Mustang represents the moment when American industrial might, British engineering genius, and aggressive tactical thinking combined to shatter an enemy that had seemed invincible. When those young American pilots climbed into their cockpits on cold English mornings, they carried with them the weight of a continent's liberation. Every mission was a gamble, every combat a test of skill and nerve and luck. Many of them did not return, but those who did helped forge a victory that ended the most destructive war in human history. The Luftwaffe never expected the P-51s Laminar flow wing to turn bomber escorts into a death sentence. But that is precisely what happened. The sleek, efficient airframe that Edgar Schmude designed in 102 days became the instrument of Germany's defeat in the air. The Merlin engine that Ronald Harker championed gave it the power to fight where it mattered most. The tactics that Jimmy Doolittle developed turned it from a defensive shield into an offensive weapon that hunted the enemy to extinction. In the end, air power alone did not win the war. Ground forces had to cross the Rhine and march into Germany. Naval forces had to secure the supply lines that kept the armies fighting. The Eastern Front consumed the bulk of German military strength in a grinding war of attrition. But when the final history is written, the P-51 Mustang occupies a central place in the story of Allied victory. It solved the unsolvable problem of escort range. It destroyed the fighter force that had protected Germany from strategic bombing. It cleared the skies for the invasion that liberated Europe. And it did all of this through a combination of engineering brilliance, industrial capacity, and the courage of young men who flew into hell and back day after day until the job was done. The next time you see a photograph of a P-51 Mustang with its distinctive belly scoop and long, graceful nose, remember what it represents. Remember the designers who created it in record time. Remember the test pilots who proved its potential. Remember the combat pilots who flew it into battle. And remember that elegant laminar flow wing sliding through the air with an efficiency that still seems remarkable 8 decades later. That wing carried the hopes of millions. And it delivered. If this documentary has provided value, please subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into military history. Share it with friends who appreciate understanding how technology, tactics, and human courage have shaped the world. Until next time, remember those who flew into the storm so that we could live in peace.